Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. So, today we're going to cover Tier 4, which, in my opinion, is the best the tree gets, at least as far as consistency and variety is concerned. There are some real standout vehicles here, so let's get into them. As always, I really hope you enjoy. First off today, we have the Centurion Mk1, which is a real shift in design. Overall, it's decent. It has decent armour, mobility and firepower, but none of these really excel in any respect. It's armed with the 17-pounder with Sabo, and its armour on the surface is pretty effective. Russian guns especially do struggle, but overall, it's not as good as it was when it came out. By their design, a tank's armour will become less effective the more new tanks of opposing nations get added. And that really has hurt the Cent overall. Long 88s and the high-powered French guns will cut right through you, and you will meet them pretty frequently. The main thing the Cent one had really was its armour, and I'm mentioning it in the past tense a bit here because I know a lot of people will have very fond memories of using this tank when it came out, but its performance really has changed and it's nowhere near as reliable. With Sabo, you can still pen pretty much everything, but you just won't secure many kills. So on the firepower front, it is adequate. It's also the first tank to have an actual reverse gear finally at 12 km/h, which is really refreshing. It's quite hard to suggest a playstyle for this tank because it really doesn't have any reliable advantages. So the safest way to play it really is to snipe. At long ranges, guns like the Russian 85 can't really pen you, though of course long 88s and the 122s will have no trouble at all. At range with Sabo, the gun is very easy to aim despite the inaccuracy of Sabo rounds themselves, so you should be able to land shots on targets somewhat effectively. It can brawl too, to an extent. Your hull when angled will bounce a lot of shots, but your turret is always going to be a weak spot as well as the lower plate. If you are fighting at close range, I'd aim to disable what you're fighting over one-shotting it. When you unlock it, I would main the Sabo for safety, and always go for the breach. Though if you do hit ammo with spare energy in the shot, it will blow the target up, but if you miss the ammo even by a tiny fraction, you run the risk of causing virtually no damage. If you're fighting a tank from the side, I'd go for the breach, or if you're fighting a tank you know has a slow turret drive, or you're pretty far away, I'd go for the driver or the engine, then the breach to secure the kill. So, pros: decent firepower, good reverse gear, and decent armour. The cons: no reliable advantages. Verdict: I think I'm going to have to say avoid it for this one. Up till now I was definitely going to go with a consider it, but there's just no real point in picking it up at this point. It doesn't have a lineup really, as it's the only 5.7, and to back it up you have the Comet and the Challenger, which really do struggle at the higher BRs you'll definitely end up fighting in. And on top of that, as a vehicle, it's really a master of none, and once you lose it, there's nothing really to fall back on. In the grand scheme of things, you'd be much better off sticking in Tier 3 with a reliable lineup and getting a few of the 6.7s that way. Grinding with this thing in particular will be slow, though if sometime down the line more vehicles are added that give it a lineup, it is going to be worth getting, but for now I just can't really recommend it. Next up is a very welcome upgrade, the Centurion Mk3. This is where things start getting good, especially regarding firepower. The Cent 3 is equipped with a new gun, the 84mm 20-pounder, with a very powerful AP round and a very high-penning Sabo round. And it's equipped with a full stabilizer, which is a huge help. The hull functionally is the same as the previous Cent, but the turret is a lot better. There's lots of different parts of the turret armour, including some hidden plates, but the weaker parts offer about 180 to 200mm of reliable protection on the mantlet, which is really good. However, the lower part of the turret and the turret ring are notable weak spots. And the problem with turret weak spots like this is that there's no way to conceal them, and how do you counter a problem like that? Well, you fire first, and that's what the Cent is very, very good at. At this tier, there's practically no other stabilised vehicles, so on the move you have the potential to fire accurately faster than anyone else. And as for your firepower, it's very good. A lot of vehicles at this tier use the 20-pounder, so I'll be using this section to talk about it briefly. It comes with a stock armour-piercing capped shell and an unlockable Sabo round, both of which are great. But it is hard to know which one to really main, as they both have drawbacks and advantages. The Sabo pens just shy of 285mm at close range, but is slightly more inaccurate and creates less spalling, especially from the side. In fact, it's possible to fire straight through the side of a tank and not damage anything with Sabo. The AP round, however, pens about 230mm at close range and does create a lot of spall damage. Even though there's no HE filler, you can one-shot tanks like Panthers from the front. However, the round will struggle in up tiers as you will meet vehicles you can't reliably pen. Basically, the Sabo is your safe but less effective option, and the AP is your efficient but less safe option. You can comfortably pen anything you meet with the Sabo without too much trouble, but it will commonly take a few rounds to take out whatever you're shooting, and this contributes to another problem. The Cent has a good reload at 8.1 seconds stock, but it does have a very small ready rack at only 8 rounds. After this is used up, the reload still isn't terrible, but it is a noticeable downgrade and most other vehicles will outmatch you. So you're really going to want to use as few rounds as possible to take targets out. Even though at 6.7 the AP can pen pretty much all tanks you can fight, what I generally suggest is to use Sabo at the start of the match as you're likely meeting most vehicles head on, so using Sabo will mean you can consistently pen all of them relatively easily. Later on in the match, when vehicles are a bit more spread out, I'd switch to the AP. Though, if you're not feeling too confident with the gun, I'd stick to Sabo and aim for breaches or engines, or if you can, the driver and the gunner in the same shot in any given tank. This is especially easy when fighting German vehicles as the gunner and the driver generally sit in a line. The Sabo as well will ammo rack a tank if the ammo is hit directly with enough residual energy, but due to the inaccuracy I wouldn't really rely on shooting ammo. Right, back to the Cent itself. Despite its huge differences, it does take some learnings all the way back to tier 2 with the Matilda and the tanks that followed. You have a great reaction time window with the stabilizer. Your armor is good, but unreliable, which means you're going to want to shoot as fast as possible. This is why I recommend Sabo for the start of the match at least. If you're going head to head, you don't need to aim for any particular weak spots to penetrate, so I'd go for the gunner or breach directly as a priority. As for where best to play this one specifically, you do have room to play around with a few playstyles that fit you best. You can work well at pretty much any range. For sniping, you have great hull down protection and the velocity of the Sabo round makes aiming very easy. And at close range, you can make the most out of the stabilizer. If you're confident, you can play fairly aggressively, but watch out for anything on your flanks. Your side armor is very weak, so be wary of anyone flanking. Like most other tanks, you're going to want to condense the possibility of enemies appearing to directly in front of you. Your mobility isn't the best, especially stock, so be careful of overextending too. So, pros: good armor, effective stabilization, great firepower, and versatile. And the cons: fairly large weak spots, and unimpressive mobility. Verdict: get it. The tank does have its drawbacks, but it's very versatile and will mould around your particular playstyle very well. Make sure you pick this one up. Next up is the FV4202 medium tank. It's a bit of an odd vehicle, but does have its place. It's equipped with the 20-pounder, full stabilizer and all the same ammo with the same 8-round ready rack system. But the main aspect of this tank is its armor. The hull isn't too impressive, it's heavily sloped but won't bounce most contemporary guns anymore, but its turret is fairly well armoured. The levels of protection are somewhat inconsistent, but overall most areas of the turret will bounce shots. Mobility wise, it's sadly very sluggish and annoyingly returns to the British tradition of having no additional reverse gears. This one has the most success in the sniping role hull down. It also gets a rangefinder which helps this playstyle even further. It's not unusable at close range like the Centurion, but your hull is just so inconsistent that most vehicles at the tier will cut through it, and it's not really worth playing on close range maps as other vehicles you have access to will do the same thing better. At further ranges, your armor does become fairly effective. Incoming rounds will of course have weaker penetration, but more importantly, aiming for the particular weak spots on the turret will be much harder. This is where this tank excels. It can really put the pressure on to lock down a sightline, and it does have the advantage of the rangefinder too. So, pros: great hull down protection, effective stabilization, and great firepower. And the cons: poor mobility, and unreliable armor. Verdict: get it. Other tanks for 6.7 Britain can arguably do this thing's job better and more reliably, but the FV in any case is a great backup vehicle. Unless you're on a map geared specifically for sniping, I wouldn't take it out first, but later on in the match when the weaker vehicles come out, its armor will become a bit more effective. It's not the best, but it can still do well. Next up is our dedicated heavy tank for this tier, the Carnarvon. The turret is effectively the same as the Cent3, but the hull is a lot more effective. The upper plate is immune from practically all APHE and AP rounds, though the lower plate is still a weak spot. Firepower is again exactly the same, except that the ready rack can hold more rounds at a total of 11. Mobility is very similar to the Cent3, it's actually kinda hard to notice a difference, though the Carnarvon accelerates a tiny bit faster. So essentially it's just a better Centurion, or rather it can do what the Cent can but just a tiny bit easier and more reliably. Close range is a bit more viable this time around too due to the armour on the upper hull, though the lower plate is still a weak spot. The side armour is still pretty poor, but if you angle slightly you should be able to bounce some shots hitting the lower plate, though this isn't really something to rely on. There's not really a whole lot else to add for this one really. Despite being a different class of tank, it plays so similarly to the Cent that there's not really too much to go on to. Though you can definitely be more aggressive with the Carnarvon. Pros and cons are exactly the same, so I won't waste your time with it, and the verdict, of course, get it. In my opinion, this is the most constantly effective tank for tier 4, and it works great in an up tier 2. Don't miss this one either. First, for the tank destroyers, we have the Charioteer. Like the previous vehicle in the line, the Charioteer takes a lot from the Avenger in it being somewhat unconventional for a tank destroyer, in that this one plays a lot like a light tank, just without most of the advantages. It is very mobile with great hull traverse and a great gun, the 20-pounder, but its survivability is abysmal. It has 3 crew and 30mm of armour on the turret. A lack of armour generally isn't a problem on mobile vehicles, but as this is British, it does only have a 3km/h reverse gear, which really kills its potential to be outstanding. I know it's a TD, but I'm going to compare it a fair bit to light tanks, as that is what it's most similar to. The main problem really is that its mobility doesn't allow for it to make the most out of its other advantages, which relegates it to playing somewhat passively. An effective light tank can zip around the map and easily retreat back into cover if it needs. The Charioteer, while quick, can't really do this, especially as it has no capacity to survive a shot into the turret. Additionally, one of its biggest problems, irrespective of the tank itself, is that it doesn't really have any place in a lineup. At 6.3 there's no point at all in maining it as a vehicle, and for 6.7 there's 5 tech tree vehicles that you could take, all with arguably more reliable advantages than the Charioteer. Granted, there's no vehicle that you could take with the Charioteer's level of mobility, but its speed just doesn't count for much when you consider how little it can take advantage of it. If you do pick it up and want to play it, I'd play it somewhat similarly to the Avenger, using that speed to find a decent early game location, stick around it and just react to how the match goes. I'd aim to get on the flanks and use the AP round instead of the Sabo, and really just aim to cover a sight line behind hard cover. Also, try not to drive around locations where you could meet an enemy on the move, as the gun bounce is pretty awful and your enemy doesn't really need to aim to one-shot you realistically. Also, be very careful of anti-air as they will completely destroy you. Anyway, pros, great firepower, and decent mobility. And the cons, terrible reverse gear, poor survivability, and lack of combat fallbacks. Verdict, I'm going to have to say avoid it really, there's just no place for it in any lineups. There's so many good options for 6.7 that you'd be putting a limiter on your effectiveness if you did have this in a lineup instead of one of the other options. I'm sure some of you have had some great games in the Charioteer, I have too, but for the sake of being as effective as possible, this just isn't really a tank I'd use. Maybe get it if you have a lot of crew slots, but if you're using the 5 free ones, I honestly would just avoid it. Next up, we have something a little bit different, the Tortoise. This is a heavy tank destroyer at 6.7 and uses a 32-pounder gun, which translates to 94mm. The damage output of this gun, interestingly, is almost identical to that of the Lorraine's gun, which is really good. Though, as you can probably tell, it's incredibly slow, which does make sense as it's covered in armour all over the tank really, even the sides. And overall, against APHE, the armour actually isn't too bad. It also has 7 crew members fairly spread out over the tank, so one-shotting it is very, very difficult. The main problems though are its weak spots. Some can be countered by angling, but the MG port on the roof is always going to be exposed, and when hit with an APHE round, it'll take out a good chunk of the crew. You of course can't hide it, but you can make it a little bit stronger. The MG port rotates, and if you switch to the direct control of it, you can actually angle the port, and it'll stay angled if you set a keybind to switch back to your primary weapon. If you angle it like this, it can bounce some shots, and if angled right, the round has to pass through the MGs themselves, and because of how MG models work, they soak up most, if not all, of the shrapnel. This isn't a completely reliable way to nullify the weak spots, as rounds will still get through, but I have definitely noticed the change in doing this at the start of the game, especially as most players get a bit confused by it and take a little longer to aim. The Tortoise, especially when stock, can be pretty tedious, but the key to getting it working really is the angling. Not including the MG port, the two most vulnerable areas are the armour around the hull MG port, which is flat, and the transmission plate. The best thing you can do really is to angle the right side of the tank towards the enemy. It doesn't really need to be much, but just enough to entice the enemy not to shoot the hull MG port. Angling it this way does create a possible weak spot where the front and side armour curve, but I found this is an area that's rarely shot at. The angling takes a while to master and is very difficult without tracks and the later mobility upgrades, but when it's spaded, it's not that bad. It works well aggressively and at range, which gives you options on most maps. Its reverse gear as well is deceptively responsive, so you can easily dip back into cover if need be. Also, try and avoid hull down positions where you need to drive up to a ridge to fire, as this will give the enemy a window to fire at your MG port before you can get the gun on target. There's no perfect position for this tank really, though it does function a bit like a wall for the team, so you are a good support tank in that regard. I'd mainly just aim to protect cap points and sight lines. You're not really mobile enough to reliably roll around the map or get to most good locations, so if you can snipe, snipe, and if not, try and support the team in a populated area. So, pros, good firepower, and good survivability. And the cons, poor mobility, and large weak spots. Verdict? Consider it. I quite like this tank, but it's definitely not for everyone. If you like tanks like the Centurion Mk3, you might enjoy this one, slow but powerful. However, I'd say the other 6.7s at your disposal are more consistent in their effectiveness. It is a niche vehicle, but if you like that niche, you will enjoy this tank. Lastly, for our tank destroyers, really is a tank destroyer, the FV4005. Most of you are probably familiar with this vehicle, but for those of you who aren't, it's a Centurion hull with a huge box on top housing a 183mm gun, which currently is the largest gun mounted to a tank in the game. It fires HESH and only has 12 rounds, but with a stock reload of 38.9 seconds, you're probably not going to fire off all those rounds anyway. This tank can be very fun, but of course it does have some very prominent drawbacks, all really tied to its firing platform. As you've probably noticed, the turret is huge. It also can't fully rotate all the way around, and is only 14mm thick all over pretty much. So anti-air, planes, and even heavy machine guns can cut right through you. Also, due to the increased weight, it is slower than the Centurion as well. This tank, like many others, is all about positioning. Anything you hit will likely die in a single shot, as it should, but annoyingly actually not King Tigers. They're very commonly seen, and due to their layout, it is tricky to take out all the crew in one shot, so if you can, avoid hitting the front plate, as this usually won't take out all of the crew. It'll disable the tank, sure, but with your reload, you're going to want to make sure every shot kills. So if you do see a King Tiger, try aiming for the side of the turret, even from the front, or just the turret face itself. If you hit the front of the turret, it'll create fragments forwards and downwards into the hull, and this usually will knock all the crew out. As for where to position yourself, a good rule of thumb is to stick with your teammates. On your own, you're pretty much constantly vulnerable because your turret is so weak and so large. You can't really poke around corners or anything like that because an enemy will have ample opportunity to shoot you first, and any shot through your turret is likely going to disable your breach. You're either going to have to lie in wait for a tank to approach you, or drive around with teammates and just look for targets of opportunity. As long as you stick around a populated combat area and don't actively make yourself a target, you can drive out and knock out tanks your teammates are engaging, as on your own you're always vulnerable. Even if you knock out a tank, any other enemies nearby will know they have at least 30 seconds to find you and know they can disable you in a single shot, so playing on your own just isn't really super viable. Also, try and stick to relatively close range. It's not the hardest gun to aim, but you really don't want to miss. Also, try and stay around some sort of lateral cover if possible, as pretty much every enemy plane can pen you top down. So, pros, overwhelming firepower, and the cons, poor armor, poor mobility, slow reload, and low versatility. Verdict? Well, get it. It's not the most practical or effective vehicle, but it does have one attribute a lot of tanks don't, and it falls into a category of vehicle that's hard to actually categorize, and simply, it's a vehicle that isn't stressful to play, and most of the time it's just fun. This is an aspect of the game that no one really talks about, but when you're playing War Thunder, and you're using, let's say, a meta vehicle that's objectively good and you die, you're likely going to feel more annoyed with yourself for dying in a good vehicle than you would, say, an AA, as everyone, including you, acknowledges that you're in a good tank and therefore are expected to have a meaningful impact on the match. But if you're playing a vehicle that isn't really expected to carry the game and you get taken out, it just doesn't really feel like a big deal. Any impact you do have on the match is welcomed but isn't really expected. The FV4005 fits perfectly into this middle ground of vehicle. It's in the same leagues as tanks like the KV2 and T95. They're satisfying to use but not borderline unplayable. They have overwhelming advantages but also overwhelming drawbacks. This game can be stressful, and I don't really think this is acknowledged enough, but without getting too real, a tank like this is a good detox. It's satisfying, somewhat relaxing, and it's what this game should always be, and that's fun. It's great to play with some friends too, just try and hide from the planes. Lastly, for the tech tree vehicles today is our anti-air, the Crusader AA Mk1. Like the Mark II, it's on the same hull as the Crusader, but for some reason it lacks a secondary plate of side armour. Not sure why that is, but anyway. This is equipped with the 40mm Bofors cannon, and as an anti-air, it just isn't really very effective. The single shot and slow rate of fire just don't make for an easy to use and effective anti-air platform. It's actually more effective as a tank hunter, though not by too much. But at 4.7, you can mostly pen everything from the side, including Panthers and Tigers. You can take out barrels and shoot through turret rings and the like, but it just isn't really reliable to play it this way, though it is how I mostly use it. It also only gets 20 clips of ammunition, which makes reacting to what's going on in the match quite annoying. I personally usually take about 2/3 AP and 1/3 HE though. Like the previous anti-air, you're decently mobile and can definitely rush caps and get on the flanks easy enough. Because of this, it does have a use in higher tier lineups, and that's catching out the flanking light tanks. There are a lot of light vehicles around this tier, and you can do a decent job of taking them out. This is how I'd play it if you do choose to go tank hunting. The problem with it as an anti-air though is that it requires a very precise aim, and this takes a lot of getting used to, and it just isn't really worth the time in learning how the rounds lead when its potential is so limited, and the AA Mark II is arguably better in the anti-air role anyway. So, pros? Decent mobility, and decent anti-tank ability for an AA. And the cons? Low ammo count, poor survivability, and poor anti-air ability. Verdict? Consider it. If you aren't interested in using it as an improvised tank hunter, I would definitely stick to the AA Mark II and avoid it, but it does still have its uses, especially late game rushing cap points and the like. However, the AA Mark II can still shred through light vehicles anyway, so it's really down to preference. The Mark I can kill some of the higher tier tanks like the Tigers, Panthers, etc., but by the point you get to unlocking this thing, you've probably spent enough time with the Mark I to get good enough at it, to where replacing it with this thing just isn't really necessary. It does have its uses, but whether they're relevant to you personally, I can't really say. First up for our premiums is the A43 Black Prince, which is a development on the Churchill. This tank is available, but indirectly. You can't buy it on the Gaijin store, but it is available as a pack on Steam, and additionally through the 299 Golden Eagle trophies you can buy from the in-game item shop, though I wouldn't recommend trying to get it this way, as unless it's been changed, the chance of getting a vehicle from these boxes is 2%. About the vehicle itself, this tank was incredible when it came out, but it just isn't up to the same standard anymore, sadly. So many vehicles have since been added that can easily take this tank out, and because of that it does suffer from Matilda syndrome, that being that you'll die in one shot off the bat or club, though the former sadly is much more common than the latter. The tank is incredibly slow with terrible mobility on all fronts. The gun is good, it uses the 17 pounder with Sabo, but that's honestly about it for the positives. It doesn't really have any consistent lineup to speak of either really, and given that at this tier, up tiers are so common, you don't have too much potential. The tank can work great, and I'm sure people have had great games in it, but as a product, it just isn't reliable enough to get constant results, and that's what you really want from a premium. So I'm going to say it isn't worth it for this one. It's expensive for what it is, and there are much better talisman options available for this tier anyway. For our second and final premium, we have the Swedish STRV-81 RB52. This is a Centurion Mk3 but with 3 ATGMs strapped to the side of the turret. The ATGMs it uses are essentially SS11s, so they're keyboard guided, but sort of. Because the missiles are angled upwards, players would commonly slap the missiles into the ground as the sensitivity is a bit tricky. So now they're mouse guided for a few seconds while the ATGM levels out, and they switch back to keyboard control, which can be really annoying to time the switch around, though it is better than just slamming them into the ground every time. Their damage output is okay, not really amazing. The ATGMs are a great weapon, but not really so much against World War II tanks, which is what you'll be fighting most of the time. Most of them have crew that are a lot more spread out than the more compact later designs, so one-shotting them is very hard, especially when you're fighting Germans. And like the Cromwell RP3 we spoke about a few episodes ago, you're actually better off not using them, to be honest. Your gun is more than capable to dispatch anything really, so in wasting the time needed to use the ATGM, your target could get out of the line of sight or fire back. This tank is currently on Gaijin store for €40. And to put that into perspective, you could buy a talisman on the regular Centurion Mk3 for about a quarter of that price. So because of this, I'm going to say this tank just isn't worth it. You have so many viable vehicles to talisman this tier that a premium really isn't going to have much worth, especially as the premiums at the next tiers are not even that much more expensive and have a lot more inherent value. More on those next time though. So for our planes today, we only really have one standout option, and that's the Spitfire Mk24. It's the latest development we have in game, and its performance really is fantastic and is well suited to the combined battle environment. It's very fast and manoeuvrable and can carry 8 RP3s or 3 500-pound bombs with 2 drops. It doesn't have overwhelming ordnance options, but its performance against contemporary aircraft really makes it worth getting, as it can control the air very well. You arguably could go for other aircraft like the Hornet or the Tempest Mark II, but as 6.7 is really the only lineup, the Spitfire is definitely the best choice here. So there we are guys, that's all the vehicles for today. On the screen now are a couple of lineups to try out. I would say the first one's probably the most effective, but there's plenty of room to play around with lineups this tier. It's a lot down to your preference, but I would always include the Centurion and the Carnarvon. I'd say the Cent, the Carnarvon and the FV4202 are probably the most consistently powerful tanks, but the FV is the one to swap out if you'd like to play one of the other slightly more niche vehicles. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Sorry this has taken a while. As some of you might know, actually probably none of you really know, I'm now a moderator for the wiki. So that means I do need to dedicate some time going on there and like filling up pages that are completely blank, because there's still a fair few of them. This does also mean when the next patch comes out, I will probably need to power grind a lot through that and do some initial articles and anything like that. I'm not 100% sure yet, but I will probably need to do something like that. So, because there's a lot to do, I will try to release Tier 5 Britain, because there's very, very few vehicles, and then after that I might do another smaller video, which I was thinking about doing. Not 100% sure yet, but because these videos are quite short, I should have them done in good time, and I should be able to kind of juggle everything else I need to do as well. Also, at the end of this month, I'm going to be making a short film with some people I know locally. I know, I've got friends, isn't that mad? So I'm trying to somewhat raise money for that. But I'm not going to just ask for money outright, but I just want to say as well that if you were ever thinking of picking up something from my shop, which I've recently restocked, now would be a really helpful time to do it. And I might post the film when it's done. Maybe. We'll see. Anyway, I've taken up enough of your day, so thank you all very, very much for watching, and whatever the next video is, I will see you next time.